College football nerds here to talk Georgia and Notre Dame, probably the biggest game of the year. Maybe Texas LSU is up there as well. But Georgia and Notre Dame, huge matchup. It's the return trip of the home and home from 2 years ago. Before we get into it, obviously want to remind y'all, please like and subscribe. It helps the channel out a whole lot. Notre Dame fans, we actually grew with your fan base a lot last year and really enjoyed kind of going back and forth with y'all all season. All right, Josh, getting into this super fast. Notre Dame has been doing the thing that we said has been lacking of Notre Dame teams in the past, and that's winning comfortably. We've been really critical of them in either their style of play or their personnel deficiencies, that they haven't been able to really put up a number against teams that are clearly inferior. So in this instance, in this season, are you feeling better about Notre Dame because you've seen them score against what I think is an improved Louisville team, a New Mexico team that we know is not very good, but put up some points instead of letting these teams kind of hang around for too long and actually flexing some muscle as a high-ranked team?
I think one of the biggest things with teams like Notre Dame is having consistent performance. And when you have consistent performance and you're playing bad teams, I mean, you should win by a large margin. And we talk about a lot that we kind of want to see you crush bad teams to believe you're going to beat really good ones, or at least to be able to beat them with any, consistency. And again, the whole point is, if you're the kind of team that's going to beat Georgia, you should also be the kind of team that's going to beat bad teams by 30 or bad teams by 40. And I understand people play up to the name with Notre Dame. I know that people disagree with this point, but I do think by and large you've got to be, at the level where you can do that. And Notre Dame this year is delivering in a way they haven't always delivered in recent years. I think there's a lot to that. One, they've been good defensively throughout the years, but they're just really big, physical, and fast. And then offensively, they're a little more dynamic. I mean, they're a well-rounded offense. They have the ability to throw the ball. They've got weapons throughout the field, and I think they can, be able to hold bad teams to low point totals, and they're able to score on bad teams consistently. And that gives you a lot more confidence going into a game like Georgia.
So with Georgia on the other side of the ball, we flagged this in our preview and a little bit last year, that it's frustrating to us that nobody's talking about them. They're the number 3 team in the country for a reason, obviously, and people should be talking about them. Now, I know that they haven't played anybody yet this year, Josh, that really matters. So maybe that's why nobody's talking about them, and if they win this game, they'll start getting the discussion they deserve. But one, do you think it's fair that they've been flying under the radar so far because they haven't played anybody? And two, because they haven't played anybody, can we learn anything about this team in terms of predicting this game or how they're going to match up against Notre Dame?
So when you talk about them flying under the radar, I think there's 2 ways that term can, be taken. And the first one is they're not being talked about a lot. And the second one is maybe they're not getting as much hype as they should in the playoff contention space. And I think to both those points, I think it's maybe a bit fair that they're not being talked about that much, because they haven't really played anybody up to this point that was able to challenge them, that was able to, you can point to and say, okay, we have a really good idea what Georgia is. Frankly, Vandy is not very good this year. I mean, they got blown out already by somebody else. So you kind of know Vandy, and Vandy was a game that I think Georgia kind of coasted through anyway. And then otherwise, the competition's just not been great. So I think on that side, it's a bit fair. But on the other side, if you talk about flying under the radar, I mean, most pundits have them, they're going to be 3 or they're going to be 4 right there with Oklahoma. Usually people have them ahead of Ohio State. I mean, puts them in, a playoff slot. And I think that's fair and reasonable. I think, if anything, the lack of discussion sometimes to a certain degree is just because there's not a lot of negatives. And I also think the big thing, frankly, that's causing them to be in this position is how the year ended last year for Georgia, losing the SEC championship game, and then going out and losing the Sugar Bowl. It put a damper on sort of the media talk with Georgia, because there's not a ton of faith that, they're going to finish the drill however good they're at right now. Now, if you know our show and the way we approach things, we're not going to necessarily penalize you because you lost an extremely tight game at the last second to Alabama, because in our view that showed that you were neck and neck with Alabama, and those kinds of games can go either way for a lot of different reasons. And knowing how much Georgia brought back from that last season, I think it's kind of silly that they don't get more hype per se. Maybe the Texas thing's its own thing, but I still think that game was a little bit of a weird one-off, at least in some ways. So I think it's fair that they're not being discussed as much given the situation, but I do think they're getting some level of hype or discussion for playoff spot, and I think they deserve it.
In a weird setup, I don't know if this is a Notre Dame thing or whatever, but they skipped a year in the home and home, so there's been a bit of separation in these two teams having the year off. For both of these teams, is it fair to say that each of them are a good bit better than when they faced one another a couple of years ago, but have both kind of improved at the same level so that it may be a wash?
I think that's also fair to say. They've both gotten bigger. They've both gotten faster. I think maybe that Georgia team from a couple years ago defensively was better, but I think the offensive line now is even better than it was then. Obviously, Georgia is a very different team with Jake Fromm now, with a much more mature passer than a guy that was just barely getting his legs under him at that point in the season. And then the other side of the ball, it's actually kind of a similar story for Notre Dame. I mean, that you get Ian Book, he gets experience. Now he becomes the passing quarterback. You're not relying on Wimbush anymore. Both these teams are much more dynamic teams, and it's almost funny or weird that last game was to a certain degree, a bit of a slugfest. And even by the end of that season, the offenses were a lot more potent and dynamic. And I think you're going to see a much more well-rounded, a much more explosive team from both teams. Defensively, I don't know if there's a huge shift for either one. I mean, they were both really good that year too. But offensively, I think they're both a lot more explosive.
All right, so let's talk about matchups. We saw early against Louisville, the speed from Louisville really, I think, surprised Notre Dame a little bit, and they were able to put up a couple touchdowns pretty fast. Is this an area, if we're looking at, we've sort of praised Notre Dame in the recent past for either stepping up their ability from a physicality standpoint, a size standpoint, or being able in aggregate to match another team with their defensive unit. Is this an area that Notre Dame should be concerned because Georgia not only has the speed of the Louisville running backs and skill players, but they also have an SEC physicality and size to go with it?
I think maybe so. There's two sides to this coin. One, Georgia has the athletes to give Notre Dame some issues. And in particular, when you talk about Georgia, you talk about the running backs. I mean, DeAndre Swift is every bit as explosive as the rushers Louisville had. And they had some issues with Javian Hawkins in that game with Louisville and Hall, and even Juwan Pass had some success running. Smith's just as explosive, only the offensive line's better and all the pieces around him are better. And then they've got a lot of really good pieces in the passing game too for Georgia. Like Simmons is a freak. So I think there could be some issues there. I think the one benefit is maybe in the style of offense Georgia plays isn't quite as apt to sort of get guys in isolation. Look, I think Notre Dame maybe has a disadvantage when their linebackers are paired one-on-one with the running backs from Georgia. That's not really a ding on Notre Dame. That's going to be true on most teams. DeAndre Swift is a high-caliber, explosive NFL running back. That's the thing they struggled with Louisville. But Louisville was a little more kind of RPO-based. They were a lot more explosive. Reminds me a lot of like what Maryland did with the first couple weeks with Loxley, what Alabama did last year, where they could get a guy one-on-one and do the RPO thing, get a guy in space, or get a guy, really do a good job of getting a guy on the edges. Georgia is much more traditional. I think that plays in Notre Dame's favor because as good as Georgia's offensive line is, and they are phenomenal, Notre Dame isn't going to get just blown back, I don't think. They're big and they're physical. Their issue is, I think, if they get, again, it's more like isolation plays, and that's a little easier to deal with the style of offense Georgia plays. Maybe they adjust, and maybe Georgia does find really good ways to get guys in isolation. Running RPO concepts where you're running a running back across the formation, or you got guys in motion, and you get them the ball while the linebackers are stressed. But that hasn't been their MO, and I don't see Georgia sort of overhauling the offense for one game.
On the other side of the ball, we've seen Ian Book kind of step up in terms of not just being the guy to get the job done, but kind of being the guy that can, like we said, put up a number offensively. This Georgia team, in my mind, the strength is on the offensive line. With losing a guy like Baker, we saw their secondary sort of fell off in the Texas game, but they had a whole offseason to adjust to that. How do you feel about Ian Book and this Notre Dame, not just wide receiving core, but skill core players going up against this Georgia defense that has a few new faces and maybe hasn't fully cemented their feel in the 2019 season?
It's interesting because I honestly don't think Georgia's really been tested. And Georgia's got a lot of speed and talent, and they've got, guys like Stokes that stepped up last year that are rounding into form and becoming veteran, dependable players. I don't think Notre Dame is outmatched to any degree. I mean, guys like Claypool would absolutely fit in the SEC, and any sort of SEC, chant talk, I think would be misplaced here. Notre Dame is a top-level team. I do think, really, the problem is this is true for both teams, but definitely the speed and physicality that Georgia brings to the table defensively is on a different level than what maybe Notre Dame's faced in the past two games. But even moreover, I don't think Notre Dame has seen teams like this even dating back to last year. And even in that last season, Clemson was a unique problem because of the defensive line and the amount of pressure they were able to generate and push. But I don't frankly think Clemson's back seven was as good as Georgia's was last year. And they were not as fast or as athletic across the board. That's the challenge for Notre Dame in this game is particularly with Ian Book, whose decision-making in like the Louisville game looked a little shaky. He looked unsure where he wanted to go with the ball. There's going to be a lot more movement, a lot more eye candy, and a lot faster players in the field to complicate his decisions. That, I think, is the issue for Notre Dame. Not really the physicality, and it's not even really that they can't match up one-on-one. It's more they're matching up with a team that can match up with them one-on-one, and I don't think they're defensively really necessarily used to that. Maybe outside of Michigan, but Michigan may not be any smaller than Georgia, but I do think Georgia's faster than Michigan is.
If I'm going to force you to get away from, because I feel like a lot of the talk has been Georgia's better here, this is something that Notre Dame isn't going to be used to based on what they've seen so far. If we're picking something in terms of the matchups where you like Notre Dame versus this Georgia team, tell me what it is, and I hope it's not field goal kicker.
I think if there's one area where Notre Dame may have an advantage, it's going to be in rushing offense. Last year, Georgia's defense was quite good, and everybody kind of knows that. But against the run, they were solid. They weren't necessarily great. I mean, they finished 31st in the country in total rush defense. But when we talk about this a lot, right? Our standard for things is really yards per play. Georgia wasn't necessarily great. They were 49th in the country in yard per carry allowed. So Georgia can be run on. They're rebuilding a lot in that front seven. They're still quite good. Now they've got guys that have stepped up and replaced guys that were starters last year. I mean, there's a lot to like about the front seven for Georgia, but it's not necessarily an elite unit. And I do think Notre Dame is a very good rush offense. Book does give them some dual threat ability. And they get a good stable of backs. I mean, it's a multi-headed attack from Notre Dame, but it's a good multi-headed attack. I think they do have the ability to move the football, particularly between the tackles.
Yeah, and I can see Georgia fans in the comments already saying, I can't believe you said Notre Dame has an advantage in the run game over us. But when we talk about matchups, we don't talk about Notre Dame's running game versus Georgia's running game because they don't match up against each other. This is Notre Dame's running game as an ability to exploit a possible weak spot in the position group that's going to match up against him, and that's namely the front seven here. I don't want to necessarily jump into my picks so early, but I feel like we kind of need to get there and maybe discuss off of that. So why don't you go ahead and give me your pick for this game, and then we'll go from there.
Overall, I do like Georgia in this game. I do think it's probably going to be fairly low scoring. I have it 31-21 Georgia over Notre Dame. I think Georgia is an underrated team, and I think Notre Dame is very good. I think Notre Dame is probably a deserving top 10 team, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they beat Georgia, because Georgia is a top 5 or better team. Quite possibly, might really be, number 1, number 2, or number 3, clearly deserving. But we really don't know that until this game is played. But overall, I think both these teams have advantages in the run game. These teams have a lot of rebuilt pieces in the front seven. I think Notre Dame isn't going to have an issue with the physicality of Georgia, but as I've already indicated, I think where Notre Dame could have some issues is the explosiveness of Georgia in the run game, be it inside the tackles or outside the tackles. Georgia does have the quarterback play to keep Notre Dame honest, as does Notre Dame with Georgia. I have a little more faith, perhaps, in Georgia's secondary than Notre Dame's, though I still think Notre Dame's is extremely good, and nobody should take offense to that in either way, hopefully. These are both very, very good defenses and very good secondaries. I just think, I guess, mainly the athletic potential from Georgia's receiving core is maybe a touch better than what Notre Dame has. I mean, there's NFL talent, especially like with Claypool and with Notre Dame, but Simmons and Holloman are very high-level receivers. You've got that freshman sitting out there in Peckins that hasn't quite taken on, but he's got all the potential in the world as a 5-star, and you got another 5-star in Demetrius Robertson. There's just a lot of speed and talent and potential, and they may not even need to rely on it, because at the end of the day, the thing that kind of decides it for me, Georgia probably has the best offensive line in college football this season. And in a game that I think if you traded offensive lines, it would be pretty much a pick 'em in my mind, with the offensive lines being the way they are. Not that Notre Dame's is bad. Georgia's is exceptionally good. That's why, to me, Georgia has the edge, and I have Georgia in this game 31-21.
So on the wide receivers, it's hard for me because they're unproven, and this is why we didn't put Pickens in our wide receiver 1A for Georgia coming into the season, because he's a freshman. We don't know what to expect. And they're still unproven. Georgia fans are going to kill me because he had a great catch 2 weeks ago, and it, highlight reel everything, but they still haven't done it against anybody. The 6.8 yards per attempt for Fromm against Vanderbilt scares me a little bit. I know it's first game of the season and all that, but it still scares me a little bit. But at the end of the day, offensively for Georgia, I do agree with you on the offensive line. I don't think it really matters, because this offensive line combined with this 5 deep stable of running backs is going to be effective. I do also think I agree with you that Notre Dame is probably going to be able to run a little bit on Georgia. I'm concerned that Book won't be able to be enough of a threat to keep them honest entirely for the whole game. I think Notre Dame scores some points. I think Georgia scores more. Give me still an ugly game, though. 27-21 Georgia in this one. I think this is going to be a feel-em-out game for 2 quarters, and it's going to be like 10-7 at the half, something like that, and then they'll open it up a little bit in the second half. Let's talk about this game in terms of national importance. We flagged a few of these games coming into the season, and it was Auburn, Oregon, LSU, Texas, Georgia, Notre Dame. And these are important for a lot of reasons, in that, and Georgia fans that want to remind y'all, we did a video called Why Notre Dame is the Most Important Team in Football. I'll link in the description. And it's because they have all these data points with other conferences, with the ACC, with the Pac-12, that allow us to get some of this relative data. For Notre Dame, if they lose this game, is that it in your mind for them in the playoffs, or do they have some breathing room because maybe the Pac-12 is flagging a little bit?
I honestly think if Notre Dame loses this game, the odds of them making the playoffs are extremely slim. You're probably going to assume you're going to get the ACC winner, the Big Ten winner, and the Big 12 winner. If it's Clemson, Oklahoma, you're going to get maybe Ohio State out of the Big Ten, and then it's just one of the SEC teams. And even if one of those falls off and loses a game, this is the problem with the lack of a conference championship. A team, let's say it's Alabama, and they go 11-1 and they lose to LSU, and LSU goes undefeated. Okay. in that scenario, if you're Notre Dame, you don't get to make the arguments everybody else made and complained about, where you say, well, they didn't even win their conference. How do they go? Well, Notre Dame didn't have a conference. That's going to be the retort, and it's going to be excused. Now, you can talk about my opinion or not my opinion. Please don't get angry with me for this point. I'm just espousing the way I think the playoff committee is going to operate under that scenario. I do think that's the way they would view it. Notre Dame is not only susceptible to a one-loss conference champion, Notre Dame is susceptible to a non-champion from a conference. That's their danger. Obviously last year, you go undefeated and you can generally get in, but the moment you lose a game without that conference championship, you're susceptible to being passed by everybody else on the schedule. And it doesn't help them, I will say, that it's unlikely that they're going to have much opportunity to make up ground. USC already losing today to BYU puts them in a hole. Stanford is just not a good team this year. Duke, I think Duke maybe can surprise some people, but it's pretty much just looking at Michigan and maybe Virginia, who's currently ranked and probably will be next week. We're recording while that game finishes against Florida State. But there's not a lot to go home from there. You're really just relying solely on the Michigan game, and at least in the eyes of the playoff committee, that's going to make it a tough hill to climb.
Yeah, and I'll give you a little pushback here because of the same argument we used last week for Texas still having a shot, in that we have a data point here with Michigan coming up, and we said it was unfair to drop Texas because we think LSU's in the top 4, to drop them all the way to 12th for playing a close game with them. I also think it's probably unfair if Michigan wins the Big Ten but loses to Notre Dame to put Michigan in over Notre Dame, when the only reason, in my opinion, that Michigan would have then only had one loss is that they didn't play Georgia. So it's not fair. It's not fair, in my opinion, to reward someone and punish someone else at the same time just because that someone else had to play a team that was really, really good and that team didn't exist on somebody else's schedule. Now we're talking about subjective stuff because it's like, well, we don't know that Michigan wouldn't beat Georgia. But in my mind, if Georgia, let's say Georgia beats Notre Dame 40-23. And then Notre Dame goes out and beats Michigan, and Michigan wins the Big Ten. I don't know, everybody, this is a lot of hypothetical, but it's an interesting discussion. At that point, I think Notre Dame has a little breathing room because I don't think the Pac-12 champion's going to get in. Honestly, they've got more on their schedule in these 2 games than Clemson does all season. So Clemson has no breathing room, although I think they've probably locked up a playoff spot. All right, let's switch real quick to Georgia. If Georgia loses this game, for them, I think you're going to argue that they still have a clear path to the playoffs, win the East, win the SEC, go to the playoffs. Is that fair to say?
It is, and the ultimate point there, it's really more to do with the fact that if they go through that scenario, what have they had to go through to get there? That requires them to go to the conference championship and beat whoever comes out of the SEC West. And the import there is, remember, making the playoff is as much about what everybody else does as what you do. That scenario requires Georgia to knock off the better of LSU or Alabama. And if they win the conference championship game, they're not going to get left out for whoever loses that LSU-Alabama tilt. So they would have to be in over LSU, over Alabama. And at that point, you're just looking at Notre Dame, Big Ten, ACC, and Big 12. I don't think all 4 of those are going to go undefeated. It's possible, but I think it's unlikely. If they did all go undefeated, then Georgia's out, I think, in that scenario. But if they don't go undefeated, if any of them has a loss, then Georgia's going to be in that scenario. And again, let me reiterate, if you talk about it's fair and how much they ding, the way I view, I'm 100% with you. I mean, if Notre Dame loses by 2 points to Georgia and then Georgia goes undefeated and wins a conference championship, you really shouldn't ding Notre Dame that much for that loss. But again, we're talking about what would actually happen due to the way the playoff committee votes. That's a different question, and that's the discussion we're having right now.
All right, we do this from time to time. I'd like to end on this as well. We've already both said that we think Georgia wins this game. We've discussed why we think they're better. But let's discuss the hypothetical of if Notre Dame wins this game, what's the headline going to say in terms of what contributed most to them winning versus Georgia?
I think the headline is probably going to be on Ian Book having a good day, but at the end of the day, and I'm going to give you the tip here, and it also rolls over to Georgia. I mean, I think the stat line for the running backs is going to pretty much determine this game. For Notre Dame to win the game, based off what I expect Ian Book to be able to do, I think Notre Dame's got to be able to rush the ball for at least 6 yards a carry. And I think for Georgia to win this game, they need to be able to run the ball for at least 5 yards a carry. I'm not going to quite say the team that runs the ball better wins, but basically Notre Dame, to be successful in this game, needs to outrush on a per carry basis Georgia, and I think they need to do it by at least a yard per carry margin. And if they can pull that off, then they can win, because Georgia's going to have a little bit of edge in the passing game, at least in maybe even from the consistency standpoint. So Notre Dame has got to win the rushing battle to be able to win the game, in my mind.
All right, y'all, that's Georgia and Notre Dame. It's a little frustrating because we don't have a lot of data to go on, or we would have run a computer model for this week. Next week, we'll probably have our first week of models because we've got enough weeks of data to put in there. But there's still some interesting discussion with these two teams. This game is a huge one for the national landscape. I'm so glad that we're in a week with actual good football instead of week 3, which was terrible. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.